Thank you all for coming. I think it's going to be a really exciting hour. I'm going to turn over to Kate Thompson, and she's going to be the Mistress of Ceremonies.
Thank you, Pat. And thank you for joining us today for our Pandemics, Primates, and World Health conversation with Drs. Tom Gillespie, Chris Golden, and Cortni Borgerson. Just as a quick summary of how our time together will go today, Chris, Tom, and Cortni will present their work and their experiences in the field. And following that, we'll have a question and answer session and panel discussion based on some questions that were submitted from our students, and then an open conversation with the audience before we wrap up. So I'm just going to introduce each of our panelists and then turn it over to them for our presentations. So with us today, we have Christopher Golden, who is an ecologist and epidemiologist interested in the human health impacts of environmental change, specifically the context of global trends and biodiversity loss, climate change, and ecosystem transformation. He is affiliated with Harvard T. Chan School of Public Health. We have Tom Gillespie, whose research focuses on the interactions among anthropogenic environmental change, biodiversity, and the ecology and emergence of pathogens of people, wildlife, and domestic animals at Emory University. And we have Dr. Cortni Borgerson, who is an anthropologist, conservation biologist, and National Geographic explorer. Her work explores why people choose to hunt endangered species and looks at how this hunting affects human health and the wildlife around them. She's affiliated with Montclair State University. So at this time, I will turn the presentation over to Dr. Gillespie, Tom, who's with us, so he can take it away. Are you able to share your screen? Wonderful.
I hope you can all see it now.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, it's great to be here today. I always love spending time at Stony Brook, even if it's virtually. It's not as much fun without parties at Pat's, but it's always an enlivening discussion and a great community for thinking about solutions. And I think that's what we're all thinking a lot about right now. So, I mean, it's never been more obvious that we need to be taking care of our environment if we want to avoid these health impacts. I think many of you probably know about the general area of my work. And so what I wanted to do today with the approach of the panel was to actually talk more about how I've been doing things a little bit differently in this last year, with sort of the case where there couldn't be a better example of these linkages. And there's no science I could do to demonstrate that more clearly. And so taking a bigger role in engaged scholarship, how do we actually see change? How do we go beyond publishing our work and helping to see policy change, to help the public as well to understand these changes? So let me see here. So for those of you that don't know, I work in a number of different sites in the tropics associated with tropical forest systems, and where we're seeing changes in those systems in terms of how people are interacting with wildlife, or where we're actually altering or degrading those forest systems in ways that are altering the interactions and connectivity between species. The places where we've been working long-term are Tanzania and Madagascar now. And so I'll talk a little bit at the end about some of those linkages. But this past year, like all of us, turned out very differently than I had intended. I was on sabbatical. So as I was about to initiate that sabbatical, everything shifted. And so Scientific American wrote a piece talking about some of the things I had been planning that we had to do differently. It was a great recognition of sort of the capacity that's been built on site at Centerville Bio, for example, at Gombe in Tanzania. The staff were really able to do a lot of things without my personal presence. But I'm hoping Pat and I will be back in Madagascar in a few weeks. We've been talking over the weekend about that. So, I've been working from afar. managing the various projects that I have, collaborating from the US. And I've also, as I said, been much more involved in engaged scholarship. So communicating these linkages between degradation of forest systems and health outcomes for ourselves and other species, as well as the really intimate linkages there to climate mitigation as well. And so I've been doing, I think, about 50 interviews in the past year with various sources. And I actually engaged with Financial Times to really get them to focus on this, because the people who are reading Financial Times are a critical audience for seeing change. These are the movers and the shakers. That's where they decide how to invest their funds, how to interact with other firms. It's an important way to think of things in a different way. We also wrote several letters to major journals to also try to really build the case for a need for shifting the way in which we're training people and the way that we're dealing with policy on a global level, all the way down to the local level. And part of that is getting the focus off of climate change as the end all and recognizing it as one of the symptoms of this overall lack of balance with nature that we have, and really stressing the importance of maintaining tropical forest systems. If we're going to reduce the rate of future disease emergence events, which can potentially become pandemics, as well as mitigate climate change, being able to do these simultaneously. And then another way in which I've been really involved in engaged scholarship is helping to guide policy for preventing future pandemics. And so I've done that as a official reviewer for some of the various UN entities for documents that they released in the past year. I've also held several fora with the UN community, so the diplomatic community, on how we actually can make One Health operational within their organizations and within their countries. And I've become an external expert to the high-level political forum on sustainable development. And this is the organization within the United Nations that implements and works towards synergy among the sustainable development goals. And so that's been a great opportunity to actually work with experts across all of these systems, whether it's agricultural systems, financial systems. If we're going to come to solutions, we have to look at these systems-based approaches and find the synergies. You know, at the same time, this has been a really big impactor on the primates. And you've seen a lot of focus on the apes, but it's really important to recognize that many primate species are susceptible to this virus. So we've been engaged in the process of educating the public on this with the media in the same way as the linkages with anthropogenic disturbance and disease emergence. And also guiding policy through the IUCN Primate Specialist Group. We created a task force specifically focused on COVID as a unique impactor. We've created best practice guidelines for apes in relation to health in the past, and we updated some of the guidelines to specifically focus on differences with COVID. And we published a letter to also highlight this threat and the importance of this within our scientific communities, but also for donors engaged in helping in these efforts. We created a hub for information on how COVID-19, how this pandemic is impacting primates. What is the science that we know in terms of their susceptibility to the virus? What's happening in terms of breakdown of normal activities for conservation and how that's impacting? And so this is a collaboration among several universities and NGOs, but it's a place you can go to find information about the current state of the situation in relation to primates. As I said, one of our big platforms is at Gombe, where we're really entering a second phase of our work using a One Health approach. So it's building on about 15 years of us collecting standardized health data on the chimpanzees and baboons in that system, but where we've only thus far integrated humans and domesticated animals in sort of snapshots along the way. We haven't had continuous information on the human and domesticated animal side of that equation. And so in the second phase, we're really scaling up to be able to have simultaneous continuous data, and also expand beyond the boundaries of the park into the true regional approach. So building in more community-based aspects to this, things that Pat had thought about and done a long time ago in Madagascar. And so I want to end this brief overview by talking about Madagascar, the wonderful things we've been able to do in collaboration with Pat and the center. And many of you've heard many things about Centerville Bio, I'm sure, so I'm not going to say much now, but you may not know that there's a major effort to screen people for COVID. So one of the laboratory spaces at the center has been set up to be able to do that screening. There has been a number of logistical challenges, not really something that CVB could control, but it's been a process that's still ongoing. And then the very positive thing here is that we're making a UNESCO-funded film to focus public attention and the global community's attention on the link between pandemics and destruction of nature. And we're planning to film a section of that in Ranamafan and at Centerville Bio. And the hope is for Pat and I to be able to be there together to do this. And so that's the trip that we're working on. And we have Juliette Binoche, who some of you may know, an Academy Award winner, who has worked as a UN Goodwill Ambassador, who will help to guide that approach to the public and to the global community. So that's a bit on my last year.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Yeah, Tom, that was amazing. Kate, how do you want to run this? Do you want to do questions for Tom first, or do you want me to launch into mine?
You can launch into your presentation. We'll cycle back. So if you have questions for any of our speakers, kind of bookmark them till the end of the discussion.
Okay. On it. All right. So thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with everyone. And Pat and Kate, thank you for organizing this. It's kind of an exciting topic for me. I never kind of find a perfect community of people that I fit in with, because I feel like I'm doing so many different things, but this one hits pretty squarely into so many of the things that I really care about. So really appreciate you kind of creating this community. What I'm hoping to chat with folks today about is a bit more of a story of how my research has evolved in Madagascar, and how this kind of One Health or planetary health framing really resonates. And it not only resonates with me and my body of research, but it resonates with people who live in Madagascar, the local community members, who really envision and conceptualize the world very much through a planetary health lens. One of the main motives of my research is to view environmental change as a public health risk. And so whether we're looking at fisheries declines, deforestation, conversion of forest to fuel and firewood, et cetera, all of these different environmental processes will have downstream effects on human health. And in fact, the World Health Organization has estimated that around a quarter of the entire global burden of disease could be avoided through improved management of our ecosystems. So what I'll walk through you today is so many of these things, whether planetary health or One Health, you can look at so many different domains of human health, whether it's infectious disease, like Tom was discussing, non-communicable diseases, mental health. What I'm going to be talking about primarily is really related to food systems and nutrition. So thinking about ways in which environmental change leads to wildlife population declines, leading to reduced access to animal source foods, how that then has consequent impacts in destabilizing food systems, leading to reductions in micronutrient and vitamin intake, and how that then can lead to increased incidence of micronutrient deficiencies. So if any of you know Pat, then you already know that Madagascar is one of the world's biodiversity hotspots. In addition to being a biodiversity hotspot, it is also a malnutrition hotspot. So Madagascar ranks 4th in the world in terms of stunting. So stunting is your height for a given age. There are international growth standards that every child should attain. When you fall below those, it is deemed that you are from a kind of chronically malnourished environment. So with more than 50% of the population being afflicted, Madagascar certainly falls into that category. Much of my work is taking place here in the Northeast. So split kind of between the Makira Protected Area and Mashwala National Park. Cortni is far more the expert in Mashwala and will be going next, so I will reserve most of my comments to Makira. In addition to stunting, you also see these kind of incredibly high prevalences of diseases like anemia. Madagascar falls into the severe category, which just generally bulks things into anything over 40%. Pre-adolescent children, which was kind of the initial population that I was most interested in, roughly 63% of pre-adolescent children in Madagascar are thought to be affected by anemia. So before going any further, I want to credit my local team. All of the ideas that I am presenting here are not my own. All of these ideas have been co-constructed with local communities, with our research team, and so much of our research agenda comes from the bottom up. So our research team is called Maheri. Cortni is smiling because she is very much a part of this team. It stands for Madagascar Health and Environmental Research. Maheri in the local language means strong or strength. It was started in 2004, and it really is designed to take on this kind of challenge-oriented research. So we have folks that are animal biologists, botanists, economists, nurses, vets, et cetera, who are all working together to take on certain types of challenges that are in Madagascar. Much of my initial work was really focused on understanding to what extent wildlife and wildlife hunting was central to human health, both from a nutritional standpoint and otherwise. So for my doctoral work, I looked at pre-adolescent children, just 73 children that I followed over the course of a year, measuring everything that they were eating on a daily basis over the course of that year, while measuring hemoglobin status to look at anemia. In the context of this study, we are seeing rapid rates of decline in wildlife populations, particularly in lemur populations. So you have households, 16% are hunting bats, around a quarter are hunting bush pig, 40% the native endemic carnivores. More than half the population are consuming lemurs, and more than 90% are eating tenrecs. To the right, you have a study that Kara Brook led with our team, looking at actually conducting population viability assessments of the lemurs based on our hunting pressures. And you can see that many of them have this kind of very short time window by which they are still viable populations within the Makira based on current levels of hunting. And so in that context, if you remove wildlife from the diet, you can anticipate that there could be an approximate 30% increase in the incidence of anemia, particularly in the lowest income households, which is the vast majority of households in these communities. So really, it's creating this connection between the stability and resilience of the wildlife populations and the ecosystem, and the kind of continuity and stability of their food system. As an extension of this, we then took on a study to do this in a much larger population. We collected this daily dietary intake information for all individuals within 150 households, followed them for 15 months. Not only were we collecting dietary information, but we were collecting blood samples, fecal samples, breast milk samples, fingernail samples, to look at a variety of different types of health-related targets. One of our main takeaways from the diet, which will be surprising to nobody who has ever visited Madagascar, is to what extent rice really is a mainstay of their diet. So this is all by biomass. If you add in the rice and the staples and the plantains, all of that together is 75% of the diet by weight. And all of that is really this nutrient poor starch. So all of the vitamins and micronutrients that they're getting is really coming from this 25% of their diet. That is the fruit, veg, seeds, nuts, and animal source foods. If you look at this on a daily basis, you can see that there is variation in when people are eating these. And if your eyes can focus on the purple, you can see domesticated meat consumption, which very much corresponds to these kind of feast and famine seasons of, if there's a holiday, yes, we'll definitely be cranking in on all of this domesticated meat that we have in the village. But beyond that, all of these forms of kind of small amounts of meat that people are able to eat on a more regular basis, whether it be fisheries or wildlife, becomes incredibly important because of the way that nutrients are absorbed in the body. In total, more than 50% of all of the animal source foods consumed locally come from wild sources. And for some households, this could be kind of the equivalent of 12 quarter pounder burgers of bushmeat per week from the forest. If we model out the diet and look at the nutrients contained within them, you can see that these diets are incredibly deficient for a variety of nutrients: vitamin B12, vitamin A, calcium, even things like zinc and protein are pretty marginal. And so what were we doing with these other samples? We wanted to understand kind of how diets connected to nutrition, but we can't really understand that pathway without understanding all of these other mediating influences that could influence absorption, digestion, nutrient demand, et cetera. So with the fecal samples, we looked at intestinal parasites. We found very high prevalence of Ascaris, of hookworm, of Trichuris. We characterized the microbiome to understand kind of the absorption of nutrients within the body. We were looking at fingernails to look at mercury contamination, particularly in our coastal cohorts. We were looking at breast milk nutrient content to look at the vertical transmission of nutrition from mothers to children. And all of these things put together allow us to understand kind of how diets and food systems embedded within these environmental and cultural contexts can then lead to nutritional status writ large. On the opposite side of this nutritional spectrum, you also have this kind of double-edged sword of the role that wildlife plays in human health. And so a lot of what Tom focuses on his work is thinking about zoonotic disease. This is something that has not been the focus of my research, but the relevance of it is clearly important at local scales. And so here you have a hunter who's hunted a tenrec, he's butchered it, he's washing his hands off. You can see this kind of very intimate connection between the wildlife blood and hands. And so any sort of nick creates a potential for a transmission event to occur. As we were working with all of these communities and quantifying all of the foods that they were consuming, we collected dried blood spots on filter paper, we collected blood samples and kind of RNA DNA shields so that we were able to look at potential zoonotic pathogens within the wildlife that folks were consuming. This is all kind of in the context of a variety of other diseases that are kind of hyper prevalent in Madagascar. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the kind of epidemic outbreaks of bubonic plague within Madagascar. This to me is something that's super interesting, and I kind of want to tell you a short story, and it is almost this metaphor for the way that all of my research happens, which is never linear and always circuitous and always kind of involving a variety of different disciplines to really understand how all of these things connect in complex ways at local scales. So Madagascar has the highest incidence of bubonic plague since the Middle Ages. It's definitely been bumping over the past few years. The eco-epidemiology of the plague in Madagascar is very interesting. Tenrecs make up 70% of the wildlife consumed by biomass. Our teams were doing mark recapture projects with tenrecs, collecting ectoparasites from them, collecting blood and DNA RNA shield, also putting antennae on their back to do radio tracking to look at the kind of human tenrec interface and where that would take place. This is also deeply connected to the spiritual cosmology of Madagascar. And just a side note, Pat's brother, I believe, is the editor-in-chief of this journal. So this article was definitely a huge push beyond my comfort zone, but I thought it was really important to characterize the spiritual cosmology of the Betsimisaraka people. And so in the darker area, you have kind of the evil pantheon of spirits. On the white, you have the good pantheon of spirits. You have the least powerful at the bottom, the most powerful at the top. So human beings at the bottom, Zanahari or God at the top. And one of the most important spirits when it comes to wildlife consumption in Madagascar is the Kalanuru. And the Kalanuru is envisioned in the same way across all 18 different ethno-linguistic groups. She is very often a dwarf with backwards facing feet, so you can't track her when you are chasing her. Long hair, long fingernails, loves caves, loves rivers, loves eating crabs. So very much pictured in the way that this artist has rendered her. Why she is important and why I bring this kind of very circuitous story to you is that she is one of the two ways in which you can receive a taboo or fadi in Madagascar. And so I began collecting 15, 20 years ago, all of these stories of why people weren't consuming certain types of animals, why it was important, what drove them to do it. And here is the prevalence of different taboos in this area. You can see the hedgehog tenrec very much at the top. Other things like flying fox and Madagascar rosette, definitely kind of very much up there when you think of zoonotic pathogen transmission. You have eels, which out of all marine species have the highest concentrations of ciguatera. You have things like taro leaves and peanuts, which are obviously way high up that are related to allergies. And what I began realizing was that there was this traditional epidemiological knowledge and that people truly understood the ways in which One Health, Planetary Health worked within their cultural systems. The reason why the hedgehog tenrec is interesting is that Steve Goodman and many others have done work to show that it is actually a reservoir for Yersinia pestis, the disease-causing agent for the bubonic plague, and it is never able to be killed by Yersinia pestis. So it can spill over into rodent populations. There's only then a roughly 20% survivorship. It can spill off directly into humans, but the tenrec populations, the hedgehog tenrec populations specifically, are never going to die out from this, which is why Madagascar is one of the lone places that still has hyperprevalent plague. And with that, just wanted to say thank you to Pat and to Courtney. I'll call her out directly since she's here, but everyone on my team who made this research possible.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I apologize for the miniature panelists who have decided to join us. It's my daughter, Carmen. So I apologize for baby noises. Courtney, would you like to take the stage? Sorry, guys.
Mike, okay, we're good. So it's hard to follow up a baby after all of that. That's much. All right, thank you guys so much. It's hard to follow up both Chris and Tom on the incredible work that they're doing, but I'm really honored here to talk to you guys today about what we've been doing in this and kind of give one example as well about a solution that we've been working on and talk about how you can actually take this two-sided interconnected problem and use that to your advantage when coming to the other side and really figuring out what do we do in scenarios where we know that this is a problem. So as you guys all know, right, Madagascar, very exciting place that you will endlessly hear about, known for its biodiversity and for its public health as well. And these two issues historically were really treated as these two separate things, right? Where they were discrete problems handled by completely different organizations for many years, or their interactions were kind of treated as these simple inverse relationships where either forests were depleted to improve food security, or if you wanted to improve biodiversity, you were going to have to reduce household food security in order to be able to do this. But what I want to talk to you guys about today, why it's so cool to be like in this group of people who all immediately recognize that these two are so deeply interconnected and that it's not only about trying to figure out why are people hunting and how much are they hunting and where, which is one part of our work, but it's also like empowering this and harnessing it to turn it around into an intervention which really recognize the interconnectedness of the system and some of the awesome things that Chris is also talking about when it comes to the cultural role of forests in Madagascar. So I primarily work with lemurs which are amazing. I'm sure I've got many a lemur person out there. They comprise 20% of the world's primates, 98% of them, as you adjust your numbers as new species come out-ish, right, are threatened with extinction primarily because of habitat loss and unsustainable hunting. And while my research focuses on unsustainable hunting, both of these issues are deeply connected to food insecurity. So hunting in rural Madagascar is really high. A lot of my work takes place in the northeast, just over. It's very convenient that Chris showed you guys a map so you guys could see. Just hop over the bay and you're over in the Mashwala. On the Mashwala bordering the park, about 86% on average of households will eat any type of wildlife. Within the prior year, this could be a bird or a mammal, and 1 in 5 households are eating lemurs each and every year. And I get asked a lot of times, like, why would you eat a lemur, right? So the 3 main predictors in lemur hunting right now are food insecurity, child malnutrition, and high biodiversity. So really oversimplistically, if you are so food insecure that you start to actually affect the health of your kids and lemurs are there, you're going to use lemurs to fill that gap and to be a part of that cultural system of food security, depending on that forest ecosystem. And this is true no matter how important you think lemurs are, no matter what laws exist, or no matter how risky you think eating that meat actually is. And rural food security is really high in Madagascar. 78% of the households that we work with are very food insecure. About half of all of the money that they spend each week is on food. And interestingly, while rice is this big part of the diet, the expenses that are going out of the household are in that little 25% of food items. About 75% of the money that's spent on food each year is going to what I like to call a sauce food. And it's just that anything you put on top of rice, that meat, that vegetable, and it's really important because that's really important for micronutrient, for health and nutrition in kids. And it's also where lemurs fall into this picture when they're considered meat. So Chris talked about this here, right? So stunting in rural Madagascar is really high. What's really interesting to me is when you start to look at those households and break them up and be like, okay, let's look at the health of the kids and households that are hunting lemurs and the health of the kids and households that have actually decided to follow lemur hunting laws or aren't. And you can see here that the kids in lemur trapper households are significantly more malnourished than those who are actually following lemur hunting laws. And a lot of the nutrition that these kids are getting is depending on wildlife. Even though it's a small quantity in rural areas, over a third in our sites of the animal source kilocalories and iron and protein are coming from wild animals. And there's variation in this depending on the individual village. But what's interesting to me is at the high side, it's 75%, but at the low side, it's 11%. And that's still actually quite high. So we have this scenario in Madagascar where we have the conservation of lemurs depending on an insecure household, which is commonly hunting them for food. And what we're doing in order to take the next steps on this is to work with communities whose food security relies most heavily on those forest resources, and then try and develop different types of culturally appropriate ways where people can obtain different sustainable, safe, and legal sources of forest foods, still respecting the role that forests are playing within that local system, but outside of protected areas. This is where I started to talk about bugs. So we tested the feasibility of farming a very abundant resource of traditionally eaten and sustainable source of forest meat that tastes like bacon. It's called secundry in Madagascar. It's often called the bacon bug because that's easier to pronounce, I guess, in the media. And we wanted to see if we could take this traditional resource and find ways that embrace the role of forest within the system. And if we're doing that, we can improve food security and then reduce unsustainable use of forests like lemur hunting. So secundry are incredibly micronutrient rich. It's kind of convenient that they also come in very small packages. So unlike a lot of other meats, you can eat them in small quantities over a long period of time. The nice thing is they arrive on their own. You don't have to move them. You can farm them on a wide variety of bean plants. Beans are incredible. They're nitrogen fixers. And there are hundreds and hundreds of leguminous species of beans in Madagascar that are either cultivated or that are wild. And when you start to look at the different ones you can use, some of these can be planted in sand with standing water. Many of them can be planted along fence lines, which means you can actually increase food, not only bugs, but also beans in places that aren't typically used for agriculture or other food types. So we had to figure out, once we learned how to farm them, how do we actually share this information in really rural places where the paperwork we distribute doesn't get used as cigarette rollers or toilet paper or other things. What we're currently doing is we developed a deck of playing cards to share the information that we learned with communities here that help explain, because this bug had never been studied when we started at this. So you ended up with a bunch of lemur people trying to be entomologists, which is quite fun, working with some incredible people there to tell, how do you tell a male and a female apart? What stage should you be eating? What's the life cycle of the bug? What do the eggs look like? How many eggs are there? What beans can I plant it on? What's going to eat it when I'm looking the other way? How do I prep it? How long does it last? All of this type of information so that we can spread this to the communities that we're working in and then others as well. And we're about 3 years post farming now, and we have a lot of bugs. Before intervention, households ate about 11 of secondary each year, and our communities following 1 year with the intervention, because we really wanted to look at like, okay, you roll this out, what can you expect within a quick year? We got 3,000 bugs on average being eaten by each household. There's a wide range in this. This max I throw in here for the 25,000 because it's really important that the people who are eating the most bugs are the people who are most heavily invested with their food security within forest resource systems before. So that's really exciting. Instead of more people eating something that we're already doing pretty well off, we're actually hitting that type market. And our control communities where we didn't do anything, so statistically insignificant, not a lot happened. So we also, in addition to that consumption, each of our communities have 90,000 live bugs in each of the communities right now in those unused landscapes. They're kind of your breeding population. What's key is that this has resulted in no increase in habitat loss, which is always your concern when improving food security, is that you're going to lose habitat at the same time. So we've been able to do this without extra clearing. So far, this has increased dietary diversity. About 23% were shifting from dietary diversity category of low to medium within that first year. And it's reduced human perceptions, which is the CSI of food insecurity, by 85%, mostly when it talks about the conversation of that because of the fattiness of the bug itself, which is really salient and feels probably a lot more impactful than it actually is. What's nice about this is that we have had an effect so far on lemur hunting, which has been fantastic. In the first year following the introduction of this within our test communities, we watched lemur hunting reduce by 30%. Second year held at 30%. We are currently getting in year 3 data right now, and I'm really excited in kind of a strange COVID-19 researcher way to see what's happened during the pandemic, because I'll show you what we've seen happen to lemur populations during that same time. Well, we've seen actually hunting increase within our control communities where we're not really doing anything. In this case, is it affecting lemurs? This is more recent data, just because the recall data when you work with humans is always from the year before, but your lemur data is coming in all the time and we can update this. When we're looking at the density of diurnal lemurs at our sites, we've seen a really truly alarming crash in the lemur populations at the sites where we are not doing work. And it's like first thing on my goal when I set foot in Madagascar is to get into the interior of national parks to see if that's sucking them out from the inside or if we're only seeing this as an edge effect. But we've seen this precipitous drop in our control communities. In the 6 communities where we are doing this farming, we have not seen that take place, which I think is a really lovely way. And this is one of many efforts, including many that Chris is leading in a lot of these communities that are involved in improving food security in these places, can actually help buffer some of the stress that can be caused by these types of events. We've actually seen the lemur populations in those places rise. And what I think is exciting about all of us being here today is not just like bugs and lemurs, which are also very exciting, but it's that by recognizing this interconnected system between forests and humans, you can actually work with communities to design solutions that will not only improve food security, but that also can improve biodiversity without pretending the two are separate and you have to rely on one or the other. I'd also like to thank a lot of people, including Chris, who I'll also call out because he's sitting here in the background, and my Harry, that are absolutely essential, and a lot of entomologists who work with us, the incredible team that is doing this right now while I sit in an office in New Jersey, to whom I'm very grateful. My family, because they're in Madagascar all the time with me, the people who actually pay for all this, and you guys, who I know are doing really cool things, and it makes me feel very awkward that I don't get to hear them today. So thank you guys.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Cortni. And thank all of you for highlighting the different ways that human health and environmental and wildlife health is so interconnected. You've touched on several of the questions that our audience submitted previously, so we'll highlight a couple of those and devote about 5 minutes each to discussion and open up then the audience, open it to the audience for any other questions they might have. But one central theme that's come up a lot in regards to the pandemic is how might COVID-19 impact wildlife conservation, specifically in regard to primate conservation, either directly through exposure to pathogens for great ape or lemur populations, or indirectly as it may affect tourism. Do you guys have any thoughts on this?
I mean, I think it's Cortni did a great job of showing one of these examples, right? Of what would happen without an intervention like the one that they did. What we've seen, within the IUCN task force group, there are a lot of issues where there's been less conservation activity, and that has led to poaching events and so on across taxa. And so it is definitely a concern. It's turned out that exposure to COVID has been less of an issue than we thought it would be at this point. So we don't have evidence yet of wild primates being exposed, but it's in many ways just a matter of time before we're going to see some of that somewhere, but we've been fortunate thus far.
Kate, I don't have, Kate might be frozen right now, but I don't have much direct expertise on this to weigh in, and I think Tom might be the best position to respond to that question specifically.
More broadly, how have you guys seen the pandemic and kind of social conversation on a broader scale? Because I mean, now a term, zoonotic disease transfer, that was relatively a niche within research, is common table conversation for a lot of people. How have you seen the One Health approach expand or influence our response to the pandemic or possible future disease events?
I think it's definitely gotten the conversation rolling in terms of people that care about these dynamics. I don't think that there is yet the level of kind of policy protocol or proactive intervention that is really aimed at stopping these transmission events from occurring in the first place. But I do think that those conversations are happening and these things do occur over kind of longish timescales. And so we do need to be patient while at the same time fighting for those types of policy protocols and interventions to occur. I mean, if you think about a place like Madagascar, we have Terapist fruit bats that roost directly above pig farms, and all of the kind of underlying conditions for risky transmission events are present in Madagascar. And so we really need to be careful in the conservation work we do, the development work we do, the public health work we do, to really understand these interconnections.
I think we missed an opportunity, didn't we? When it was at the very beginning, the wildlife markets were targeted as the place where COVID came from. And then suddenly there was silence. Nobody pushed that farther into something that would result in policy. I think China in the first months did stop the wildlife trade markets. Is that true, Tom? I'm not up to date on it.
They shut them and then reopened them, and now they're shutting them again.
They are shutting them again.
Yeah.
So can we push now to make it something in the UN level about wildlife trade?
So that type of activity is central to a lot of the discussions within the UN right now. This moment has really created the discussions among people who normally weren't talking. So the silos are breaking down within the UN groups. And so like having these fora with the UN diplomatic community, that's, people from across different areas of expertise. And I, as a scientist involved in these things, I'm having discussions and I'm having to learn a lot very quickly about, global financial systems, global agricultural systems and how those are interfacing with national level activities in different countries. And at the same time that we're seeing kind of all of those discussions really happening, as Chris said, it's a slow process to see that transform into policy, but it's happening at a rate that's unlike anything that's happened before. People are way out of their comfort zones, trying to communicate, trying to get toward the change that's needed. But in the same way that, you know, we're all hearing about building back better after the pandemic, when you look at countries investing, everyone is saying, yes, we want to do it green, we want to do it better. Only a couple of countries, you know, like Germany and Turkey are the only countries that have so far demonstrated a true focus on green technologies and shifting from the current systems that are actually promoting the degradation and increasing the risks. So it's really that key issue of getting the discussions going, keeping the momentum going, and then seeing a transformation into policy. But we all know doing that at the global level, because there's no global governance, is extremely difficult. But if we can start seeing that happen country by country, especially in the places where the impacts can be greatest, we have a lot of opportunity right now. This is a key moment for us to be able to do something to change the direction of things.
I think adding to that as well, one thing that I really hope that we manage to do as we continue to ride this, you know, recognition of the interconnectedness of human and wildlife systems is also then not forget the role that they are playing in food security in so many places, given that in many sub-Saharan African countries, a sole removal of the meat from the system could be really problematic. And then also just by, you know, like anytime you're telling someone not to do something, you know, like making sure that we do it in smart and correct ways where there's something to shift onto, right? When you're removing that, and that we don't just drive it underground where we can't monitor it and see what's happening and follow these systems as zoonotic diseases like this one continue to cross over each and every year.
And something that's been really interesting to me related to what Cortni was just saying is that within the UN community, there is in general that recognition, but the media is desperate to create this polarized vision. So I've done probably 10 interviews with major media sources that they ended up not using any of the content of what we discussed over an hour because I would not push for a universal ban. And I kept stressing these points, but they just, you know, like CBS News, for example, like they had 2 different times where they tried to do this. And there's a desire to simplify it for the public in a way that's a true disservice.
So transformation of wildlife consumption to something else. I had wanted to ask Chris about the chicken project that you had. I just wondered because we were talking about the insects and, you know, it may be more intuitive that maybe somebody would like to eat chickens rather than insects. So what did happen with that project?
Yeah, so that project is still ongoing. It has been majorly successful so far. So just to explain to others, we basically tried to do a rural appraisal of what might be a proper substitute to wean people away from wildlife. And so we did research through kind of a variety of different angles. When looking at it from a taste preferences standpoint, we had people rank taste preferences across all types of wildlife and domesticated meats. And chicken came out far ahead of many of the different types of wildlife and almost all of the domesticated meats. When it comes from an economic standpoint, chicken was more expensive than wildlife, yet more preferred. And so if there's a way to increase production and then thereby reduce price, you could kind of naturally wean people away from it. Going back to what I was discussing earlier with taboos and the system of FADI, nobody has a FADI for chicken. There are FADI for a variety of different types of wildlife species and other types of food items, but you will very, very rarely meet anyone that has a fadi for chicken. And so from a kind of mainstreamed population level intervention, that works. And then finally, it's very often a gendered asset. And it's very often something that is more controlled by women. And we know from kind of the entire history of the field of development economics that when you create systems that support women, you are going to support education, healthcare, nutrition, et cetera. And so for so many reasons, kind of chicken was the answer. The number one issue where we were was Newcastle disease. And so our team helped to co-develop a thermostable vaccine for Newcastle disease with Imvavet in Madagascar. And we've now been running these pilots for 5 or 6 years, and it's gone very, very well in our initial subset of villages. We've now expanded to a larger set of villages, and Imvavet was planning to branch out far more during the time that became COVID, but is now getting their feet back under them again and is kind of beginning to do this in regions beyond the Northeast.
So Newcastle kills poultry right away.
Newcastle kills, in our area at least, roughly 85% of chicken flocks seasonally. And so it was a pretty virulent version of Newcastle disease virus that we had in the Northeast. We've not done careful investigations of this elsewhere, but we know that it goes by different Malagasy names in different areas. We know that it's present in other parts of Madagascar, but we've not done that research.
So one question I just want to make sure we have time to bring up before opening things, given that actually even during the beginning of the panel, a couple students brought it up as we were starting, is for undergraduates and graduate students that are inspired by the interdisciplinary and innovative nature of this work. How would you advise them to get involved, whether it's within academia or more broadly outside?
Just to clarify, we're talking about at the undergraduate level, because I always feel like the advice changes, right?
It's been asked at both graduate and undergraduate level by many students. So whatever you feel you can speak to best.
I let the others go first last time, so I'll dive in. Just to first and foremost, say yes to everything, right? Like there are little hints I feel like often that are given to undergrads where like you're nervous and you're not sure and you're not ready if you're going to take it, like do it and email and ask. I mean, as an undergraduate, my first research opportunity, I literally got an article of National Geographic in the mail and wrote the people in the article and was like, can I please be your field assistant with like 100% undergraduate gusto? And they were like, check back in later. And I did. And I eventually worked with them for 2 summers. So like ask, you know, have the drive more than anything else, you know, be enthusiastic about mud and mosquitoes and muck and it'll follow through. I think at the next level up, this connection is just fantastic because when you make that transition from studying the problem to trying to fix it, you have to be here in this world of this interconnected pieces of how humans and the environment and wildlife are all fitting together. So whether it's a conservation NGO or a public health NGO or an academic job, which suddenly you can tailor yourself in a million different ways at about, you know, every department known to man on campus, they will appreciate this perspective. And then we'll get answers from the people who are far more experienced and employed than I.
Yeah. I was going to say something quite similar in one way, which is it never hurts to email folks and ask about opportunities. So many people that get started in conservation or in public health are not doing this for the money. They were kind of mentored by someone in their past and they want to pay it forward. And so I think it never hurts to reach out to folks. The one kind of added piece of advice that I'll give is there is no perfect training program. This is all, unfortunately, still so cutting edge that you will never find the right university, the right perfect mentor, the right anything that captures 100% of your interests and the skills that you want to develop. And so don't get frustrated by that. Just recognize that that is a fact, that is the current state of affairs, and know that you will need to build all of the pieces of your community and your mentorship team and your advisors and your collaborators yourself and kind of move your research subject forward. And so Harvard's not the right place, Montclair is not the right place, Emory, none of these kind of names are the right place. It is all about kind of you finding a topic, you finding people that are willing to work with you and to kind of set you forward on that course. And similarly, there is no right kind of profession to adopt these things. The folks that I have in my class right now come from the business school, the law school, the school of government. They come from biologists, ecologists, et cetera. But you can take this worldview and have a meaningful impact on the world, no matter what career you end up choosing.
Yeah, so I mean, you're hitting the nail on the head. I mean, it's the most important thing is to pursue your passion. And there are definitely going to be ways to apply that to these problems that are facing us as a society. And so don't think you have to become a veterinarian to work on the health of wildlife. That's a really common misperception, for example. So I end up with a lot of people that I mentor. They have become a veterinarian. At the end of that path, they realize, hey, I'm still not doing what I thought I was going to be doing. Then they go on to do a PhD. But in fact, the point that Cortni made of, put your neck out, make those connections. I had one of my a former veterinary student of mine gave a guest lecture in my course this week. She's now the director for the epidemiology group for rickettsial disease at CDC. It was just that initial reaching out and saying, Dr. Gillespie, do you have opportunities for summer research? She came to Uganda with us, got involved. She ended up, after her veterinary degree, continuing on as a PhD student with me, made the transition when I moved to Emory down there, even though she had just finally given in and bought a very, heavy winter coat, being a Floridian in Illinois. So just follow your passion, because you'll burn yourself out if you're not doing the things that fit you. And there are going to be plenty of ways to apply that to these problems. I'm also, I stuck my neck out there and went and talked to the people who I admired most when I was at your stage. And Pat was one of those people. And we're here today working together to solve problems. So it's really, really important to make those connections and don't worry about being in the correct field. Like Chris was saying, you don't need to be at the correct university or have the correct major. You need to do what you're passionate about and find how you can be part of the solution using that tool, that skill, that thing that drives you.
There's something called the Planetary Health Alliance that I think, how is that going? Is that really making that transition between the wildlife and human health? How are you? I mean, we can be honest here.
Yeah. So I stopped working with them about 1.5 years ago, Pat, so I can't give you any kind of current updates. What I will say is that they don't focus much on wildlife health at all. It's really about creating a community of practice for people interested in planetary health. And so I would say that with their agenda of creating a community of practice and creating educational materials, they've done quite well. But there's still a lot of stuff missing that needs to be picked up by many other parts of this community.
Yeah, I would just add that they have done a better job than sort of a lot of the other ways of conglomeration to get MDs more engaged. So MDs have often been the last to engage in these innovative interdisciplinary efforts, and there's more traction with the planetary health construct among MDs. I've seen that both within my own university and across universities. But
I went to that first meeting at Harvard, and I just felt that, like Chris was saying, and Tom too, that it was very medically focused, and they were leaving out our part of the planet. And I don't know where they are now. Do you know, Cortni? Do you have any updates?
Chris would have been the person I would have recommended that to. So.
What about another question?
I
I don't know if Carmen is okay. Cool. Yeah, I just want to recognize that we're at 5 p.m. But if the panelists are okay with it, maybe we can take a couple of questions from the attendees if you guys can stick around for a couple more minutes. All right, so we'll open it up for questions from the attendees. You can, if you don't feel comfortable unmuting yourself, you can just go ahead and unmute yourself and say your question, or you can type it in the chat and we can take a look and we can read it out loud for the panelists. So I'll just open it up for questions.
Hi, so first of all, I want to thank you all very much. I was wondering to what extent the app iNaturalist has been used in Madagascar. That's one of my favorite apps. I've been able to identify a few hundred species just on campus, and that's just walking like between classes and things. So I was wondering if that has been used in Madagascar.
I'm working with Cal Academy of Science right now on the insect project. We're the developers of that. And let me tell you, when you start to work with a new species that not a lot of people have studied, all of our original data to look at the range of the insect, other than museum specimens, to look at more recent places and places where you need to follow up specifically to, we're using iNaturalist. And it's been, I'd never used it before, and I can just say it's what an incredible community to reach out then to every single photo and be like, hey, do you have any other photos? I need to see the plant that it's sitting on. And then immediately people reach out. And I've just been, I was a new user, but I'm incredibly, incredibly impressed.
Thank you.
Right, any other questions? All right, well, if there aren't any other questions, do you want to, I don't know if Kate.
Yeah, I can. She's intermittently quiet. Taking a break from vocalizing, so I can hop in. Thank you all for your patience with this. But yeah, thank you, Chris, Tom, and Courtney for joining us today. I think this work is not only extremely relevant, but also extremely inspiring to many of the people that joined us. So thank you all for your time, and we look forward to staying in touch. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Great to see you, Pat and Kate.
And remember, we're still here when we leave your computer. So reach out to all of us anytime.
Thanks. I really appreciate that you all have participated in this, and it's a shame that we have to part now, because it's very difficult to have a community that is really engaged in the crossover. I mean, as Chris said, it's just not there. I mean, the discipline isn't there. And I think one of the things that we all should concentrate on is, okay, let's put the discipline there. I mean, we have it, we have the concept. You know, I don't know whether any of you remember, it's so long ago, but there was a time when ecology and evolution was born as a discipline, and it didn't exist before it was born. Well, it's the same thing as what's happening now. And so we have to all work very hard to make sure it gets born right after COVID leaves us. We have a rebirth of this crossover kind of discipline of really understanding. And we didn't emphasize enough, I think, the fact that if you're working with the environment, you can prevent disease. It's like prevention. I am so sick of Band-Aids. You know, you get sick, somebody gives you some medication. Oh, thanks. But that's not really solving the problem for the world, is it? We've really got to work on the root causes of these diseases. And I know Tom and I have been working for a long time, figure out what it is that how can you prevent the disease before it occurs? And that's what we all have to do. We don't have to, and we can't wait for another pandemic. I mean, it's just true. I remember the first time Tom told me that there was going to be a pandemic coming up the line. And I thought, no, there's no way that some virus can stop the world. And I thought he was really exaggerating. And look what happened. I mean, it's just outrageous. And but we really have to put our heads together. It's not like a discipline that's frivolous. It's a discipline that's really necessary, and we have to really get to the roots of how to stop this crossover business and how to stop the destruction of our planet. I mean, planetary health is the health of our planet. It's not just people. It's the whole thing. So I really thank everybody that pushed us into making this a topic. That's all my students. And I really thank those of you that came forward today to enlighten us. And I'm hoping that we can meet again. And thanks, Kate, and Beatrice for putting this together. It was great.
Yeah, thank you all for joining today.
Okay. Bye-bye for now.